The GDP growth estimate released yesterday for the second quarter of this financial year came in at 6.3%, and the estimate for gross value added was 5.6%. Now, there are several ways to look at this. Like, say, for example, the chief economic advisor, he said, and I quote, "This data confirms that the economic recovery continues and most components of economic growth are stabilizing at a moderate pace." On the flip side, you had former Finance Minister P. Chidambaram, talking about how Q2 growth rate was lower than Q1 and how it was lower than Q2 of the previous year. And he was saying that this is a troubling sign. There are yet other perspectives that compare India to its global counterparts and say that developed countries, many of them are running a risk of, going towards recession, whereas India is actually growing quite strongly. So there's that perspective as well. And finally, there's the perspective which is, why should I care? What does GDP, GVA, what does that have to do with me? And it's to answer that question that we are here in this edition of Macro Sutra. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, economy editor at ThePrint. And we have, as always with us, Radhika Pandey, who's a noted economist and long-time collaborator with ThePrint and consultant at NIPFP. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So now, before we get into what the data says, could you explain to us what GDP and GVA, what they both measure?
Right. So GDP measures the final value of goods and services. In money terms, what is the final value of goods and services produced during a given period? So if we are saying GDP of a quarter, it means GDP of that, what is the value of final goods and services produced during that quarter? So that is GDP, gross domestic product. And within the domestic territory of the country, that is very important, that whatever is being produced, final goods and services that are being produced within the territory of the country, that is what is termed as gross domestic product. Now, GVA is the activity, that is the production of goods and services, agriculture, services, industry and so on. Now, there is a slight distinction between GVA and GDP because GDP also includes taxes, which is paid to the government, and it excludes subsidies which are paid to producers. So that is the difference between GDP and GVA. Otherwise, they both measure the level of production of goods and services, but GDP includes what is termed as net indirect taxes. Net indirect taxes means taxes minus subsidies, because subsidies are going to the producers. So it is part of the GVA and not part of the GDP. So that's the conceptual distinction.
Right. And so the difference then between the GDP level, which is 6.3, and the GVA, which is 5.6, what would explain this divergence?
This would be essentially on account of indirect taxes.
Oh, it's the taxes itself?
Right, yes.
I see. And so now when people say that, say manufacturing, agriculture, services, all of that now is part of GVA.
Right, that is part of GVA because that is the activity being measured. So what we have is on the activity side, what is how we are reporting, that is gross value added. And on the expenditure side, how we are reporting, like what is the consumption, what is investment, what is government consumption expenditure, our earnings from exports and expenditure on imports, that is all reported as part of GDP. So when we look at the press release which is released by MOSPI, which was released yesterday, we have few tables on GVA and then we have tables on GDP, both expressed in at base year prices, which is 2011-12 prices, and at current prices.
And this approach of using GVA as also a measure, it's in line with global standards?
Yes, now it's in line with global standards because earlier what we used to measure was only GDP at constant prices and current prices. Now we have the corresponding measure of GDP at constant prices is GVA at basic prices. So that is in line with the international best practices, and that is what changed with the 2011 base year change when we moved to the new base year.
Yes. And so now coming to the numbers, what does this, say, 6.3% GDP growth, what does it actually mean?
Yeah, so 6.3%, when we say 6.3%, it means the year-on-year change. That is the growth in the July-September quarter of this financial year over the July-September quarter of 2021-22. That is the year-on-year change. Now, as you rightly pointed out, there are various perspectives. People say that there is one perspective, it says that growth has slowed from 13.5 to 6.3, but if we look at 13.5 in the first quarter, this was on a low base, because in April to June of 21-22, that was a bad quarter. That was a period of low growth because of the second wave of COVID. So we are seeing base normalization, and therefore 6.5 or 6.3% growth is essentially on account of base normalization.
Right, I see. And now, going into the sectoral data, it's showing that manufacturing contracted by 4.3%. This, number one, seems to be a larger contraction than was expected. And two, I mean, what impact then does this have on things like employment? I mean, does it mean that employment suffered in that period?
Right. So one of the pain points of this entire GDP numbers is the slowdown or the contraction in manufacturing, and even though its contribution in GDP is not very large, it is now services driven economy, but in terms of employment, manufacturing has a big role to play. So if manufacturing sector contracts, and then it means that there are implications for employment. Employment picture is not very encouraging, particularly if we look at which subsectors within manufacturing have contracted, because the National Account Statistics in its quarterly release does not give us information about, okay, manufacturing has contracted, but within manufacturing, which sector? Is it textiles or is it metals? Which sector has contracted? But it is actually possible to estimate or replicate that exercise using the company database that we have, the CMI Provis database, which gives us the information on manufacturing firm. It gives us information about the profitability of firms, the wages and salaries, and the depreciation. So we can, GVA is measured through income approach, which is looking at profits, wages, and depreciation. So we can actually replicate the NAS methodology, though there will be differences, subtle differences, but overall we'll get a sense of the broad trajectory of growth. So when that's I've discussed in the article that within manufacturing there are some sectors like metal and metal products. Textiles, these have seen steep contraction. Now, textile is a problem because textile has seen steep contraction for the last 3 consecutive quarters, and textile is a big employment generating sector, so that is a worrisome factor.
Absolutely. But on the flip side, keeping employment as the focus, if you look at agriculture, the growth has actually accelerated this quarter over the previous quarter to 4.6% over 4.5%. Now, about 60% of our population is in agriculture. So then does this have a positive outlook? Yes,
it does, because now we need to see that July to September quarter from the point of view of agricultural activity is actually a lean season. So if we are seeing a robust growth in agriculture, it's also due to allied sector activities that may also be picking up. So that's a very encouraging and positive sign that while on the one side manufacturing has exhibited contraction, agriculture has done better than its long-term average growth. So, and it's despite concerns about sowing, slowdown in sowing, uneven monsoon, agriculture has done better. Primarily, we can make out that it is due to better performance of the allied activities also, which is an encouraging point.
Right. And so just as in manufacturing, profits drive the GVA growth to an extent. Can that be translated to the fact that incomes of farmers went up in that quarter, and so that's what drove agriculture GVA?
Yes, because prices have risen, agricultural prices have risen. So that is also one of the reasons for increase in the agricultural GVA.
That actually brings me to a related point, which is how does inflation, the actual increase in price that people pay, how does that impact GDP growth and GVA growth?
So that will be visible if we see the difference between constant prices and current prices. So if we for every variable we have the constant prices and current prices data, and if we see a wide variation or deviation between constant prices and current prices, that means it is the price effect which is playing, and that is very much visible in the mining sector this time, if you see, because in the GVA gross value added of mining at constant prices has contracted by 2.8%, but if we look at GVA of mining at current prices, it's above 30%.
Oh.
Yeah, so it is 32%. So if we see this deviation, it's actually the price effect which is playing out, because the IIP of mining, which is the production, has actually contracted in September. So this is how we can actually see where the prices are playing out, because again, we have various price indices. We have CPI, we have WPI, we have the GDP deflator. So they all play out in different ways, but in GDP, the price metric that we are looking at is primarily the GDP deflator, which is the difference between the current and the constant prices, that price measure, and that we can see for some of the sectors very distinctly, like for mining we can see.
Right. And now, does GDP and GVA, does the way that the Indian government measures it, does it include the informal sector or proxies for the informal sector? Because again, about 80% of our employment is in the informal sector. So does that get counted? Is it being accounted for?
Not in the quarterly measure, but in the annual data at different revisions, because we have various surveys which are done to that serve as proxies for the informal sector. So they get incorporated in the annual data, and even in the quarterly also, like this figure that came out yesterday, this will also get revised. So we will see, but informal sector is mostly covered in the surveys, and also some part of the informal sector is also covered as part of IIP, the Index of Industrial Production.
Right.
Yeah, and IIP is a proxy that is used in the GVA estimate, so that way it gets covered.
I see. And now, one possible way, I guess, to see how the informal sector is doing is to look at private final consumption expenditure.
Correct, yes.
And so first, if you could explain to us what private final consumption expenditure is, how it has moved, and what that means.
Right. So we've talked about the activity side. Now from the expenditure side, we look at consumption. Private final consumption expenditure is a proxy for consumption by households and by private investors. So that is private consumption. It's a most important measure from the spending side or from the expenditure side, because almost 57 to 58% of share of GDP is accounted for by consumption. Now, it has seen an increase in terms of share of GDP if we compare as compared to the corresponding quarter of the last year, that is Q2 of 21-22. Even in terms of the year-on-year change, there has been an increase of around 10% in constant prices. Now, this is the metric which is most important, which will sustain or drive or determine the trajectory of growth going forward, because external headwinds are emerging and they will continue to pose downside risks to growth. So, if we see consumption picking up, and if this pickup is sustained, that will ensure a decent GDP growth, because the feature of the economy is such that we are not so much dependent on exports. It is the domestic consumption which is the main driver. So if we can ensure through various policy support or through benign environment that we have consumption picking up, that will ensure a stable, decent GDP growth.
I see. And so now, how does the government decide or define what consumption expenditure is and what expenditure on capital? Like, say, suppose I were to build a house, would that come under consumption or would that come under capital formation?
That comes under capital formation. Within capital formation also there are a number of categories. There are investment by households, the investment by sectors also.
Right.
So there are consumption goods, those are covered under the private final consumption expenditure. But any kind of asset creation, be it by a household, be it by a private entrepreneur, be it by an unincorporated enterprise, all these we have these sectoral distinctions within investment also. That data is also sectorally available.
So that would that be the gross fixed capital
formation? Yes, that is the GFCF by sectors and by institutions. So that is how the GFCF data is aggregated. We look at GFCF by institutions and sectors.
So, and how is that done? Is investment still being driven by the government, or is the private sector starting to?
Yeah, so if we look at the GFCF, it has held steady. It's around 34.6 or 8% of GDP. So it's stable as compared to the previous quarter. We have not seen a decline. And again, in terms of GDP, it has shown a growth of above 10%. So investment has been doing fine as of now, though it is mostly driven by government capex expenditure. But we are, through now, whether private investment is also picking up or not, that we can see through a number of high frequency indicators. We can look at other indicators like what's happening to capacity utilization, what is happening to bank credit by industries. If bank credit by industries is also picking up, that means they are sensing some visible signs of a pickup where they are being incentivized to generate fresh investment. So that is why they are doing. So it is primarily the pump priming is being done by government, but we are seeing some green shoots of recovery in even private investment also, looking at the other indicators.
Right. And do you feel that these 2 quarters of data that we have, plus now once the Q3 data comes out, the government will have enough information to kind of inform the budget making process?
Absolutely, yes, because they have this half yearly data now, and for the high frequency indicators, they also have data for October. For some, they will have data for November, along with the budget, along with the GDP, the CGA numbers, which are the trends of what's happening to revenue expenditure, what is happening to capital expenditure, that was also released. So based on all these will determine the policy direction in the budget, and I think what the sense that we are getting is that the emphasis on capex by the government will continue in the coming budget also.
Right. And now we can take a few questions that came in from the public. Jayant Deshpande asks, he's asking us to kind of explain what happened, why manufacturing and mining contracted.
Right, yeah. And so we discussed in some part earlier, manufacturing has contracted because of input cost pressures, energy prices, and also export slowdown. So these are the 3 factors in general that explain the slowdown in manufacturing. And within manufacturing also we can see which sectors have performed badly, looking at the CMI data. And because of this, even before the GDP data was released, we could actually see that the manufacturing sector has not done well, because if we look at the profit numbers, till now profit numbers were quite impressive. After the COVID quarter, the April to June 2020 quarter, where the profits contracted, since then profits were doing quite well because of maybe cost cutting, but profits were doing well. So this is the first quarter after the COVID quarter of April to June 2020 that we have seen a contraction in profits, and that's a very steep contraction of 23-25%, reflecting input cost pressures, energy prices, and export slowdown. And we've also discussed the main sectors that were impacted. Now here One sector that requires attention is the metal and metal prices. Now, metal and metal prices, they surged. Metal prices like aluminium, copper prices, they surged at the time of the war. The pandemic, Russia-Ukraine war, it surged around Feb-March, and since then there has been a correction. So now if the prices slow down for metal and metal prices, metal and metal segment, that's a bad news, and that is what is getting reflected in the GVA there, because they would want that metal prices rise because that is the source of revenue for them. So that is for manufacturing. And for mining also, we spoke about that, while the production has slumped, as is visible from IIP, prices are high, as visible in the mining GV of current prices. So these two factors explain the contraction in the GV of mining.
Right. And now Vinayak Sardesai, he also asks about manufacturing, but he also then brings in the services sector, and he says that is the strong growth in the services sector that we saw in Q2. It's lower than what it was in Q1, but it's still relatively quite strong. He asks, is this due to pent-up demand and will it cool down eventually? Or rather, do you think that it's the base effect again?
So for services, we are seeing a movement towards normalization. That is what I would sense it like this, that this is more a move towards normalization, because now with the COVID receding and economy moving towards normalization, we are seeing increase in demand for travel, transport, hospitality, and these services. Some part of it is definitely pent up demand, but I think going forward also the demand will remain sustained, because the nature of demand is also shifting. Consumers are shifting from goods to services. So I think the services will sustain GDP growth over the coming quarters also.
And that, of course, then again is good news in terms of employment and incomes and all of that.
Also exports, given that whatever is the globally challenging environment, but we are primarily services exporters. So if our services do well, it is a good news. Right.
And we have a question from Sankalp, which is that how can India squeeze an extra 2% of growth, especially given that we've already reached our fiscal and monetary kind of, we've tried everything, we've reached the end of our wits. How can India buck the global gloom, and what would be the internal growth drivers?
So see, even in this challenging environment where we have slowdown, some of the countries have already declared that they are in recession. Like UK Central Bank made the statement that UK is heading for a recession, and a long recession till 2024. So if we have these countries who are heading into a recession, it's a challenging environment. And along with that, we have monetary policy tightening by both advanced economies monetary policy tightening, RBI monetary policy tightening. So amidst these challenges, even if we are able to attain a 6+% growth, 6.5% growth, it is decent enough. What is required is to more focus on employment generation and to focus on what are some of the structural issues in manufacturing sector slowdown. Because while manufacturing sector has slowed down, manufacturing has seen a slowdown in this quarter, but if we go back even in the pre-pandemic period, 2019, even there we saw manufacturing GVA contracted. So this has some deep issues which require attention, which require course correction. So more emphasis on labor intensive sectors, more support, and looking at what is ailing these labor intensive sectors. That is a more credible move towards attaining a higher GDP growth.
And now this the final question, which is kind of forward looking. Now the core sector data just came out for October, and it was 0.1% growth. And apart from that, on the other side, PMI manufacturing for November came in at a 3-month high. So now how do you reconcile these things, and kind of what is the outlook? Like, what do you think will happen in Q3? RBI says that Q3 and Q4 will likely see less than 5% growth.
Right, yes. So yeah, RBI says that the growth will be somewhere around 4.6% in both the quarters. This is essentially on account of further base normalization. So that is what, even if we achieve 4.5% growth in the next 2 quarters, we'll be on track to attain 6.5 to 7% growth for the full financial year. Now, what will be the growth going forward? That depends on, firstly, the positive impact of festival effect that we will see. Now we are seeing the commodity prices are easing. Crude oil price is easing. It has come down below $90 per barrel, given that RBI's own assumption of when they make these projections is $100 per barrel.
Right.
So now if the oil prices have come down, it's a good news. So there are some positive factors, and the negative factors, of course, recession and export slowdown. So all these factors going forward will determine the trajectory, and also what RBI will do, because there is this talk now that next week we have the RBI's monetary policy statement that RBI will slow down on rate hikes. So all these factors will determine the pace of growth going forward.
Right. So manufacturing is a concern. Services is doing pretty well and looks like it will continue to do well. Agriculture has been a bright spot. Global gloom and doom is happening, but there are various steps that India can take to kind of insulate itself, insulate the economy. But this is no time for complacency. That seems like a great note to end this discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you for sending us your questions. Good day.